Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Steve Cronin Patreon podcast, episode number 1, available only at patreon.com/Steve Cronin. All right, guys, this is episode number 1. This is it. I have decided to do a monthly podcast for my Patreon subscribers for 2 reasons. First of all, as a thank you, right, to give you additional content, more long-form premium content, right? A lot of the YouTube videos I post average around 4 to 5 minutes in length. There are some that are more. I've been doing a lot of, some of these top 5 videos recently that can run a bit longer, but I really wanted to offer some kind of long-form content so you can get a sense of what it's like to kind of have a conversation with me. Although I suppose this isn't really a conversation, but maybe it could be, right? As this evolves. But bear with me, right? This is episode 1, and it's really what I'm doing is I'm just kind of recording this through my Blue Snowball microphone, and I have a topic in mind, something that I cannot explore in a 5-minute YouTube video, and it is on consciousness hacking. And the more I think about it, the more I imagine this would probably have to be a multi-part podcast, right? Just because you can tackle this subject from a lot of different angles. So here's how this is going to work. Welcome to the Patreon podcast. I am going to release one of these guys at least every month. If I have fun with it, and if I get really good feedback from y'all and y'all like it, maybe I'll do it even more. Maybe twice a month. Audio only, and they're going to be long. I like to ramble. My YouTube videos, it's really about conveying tips and techniques to increase focus and productivity in someone's life, professional life, personal life, work, school, etc. It's not really about creativity, and making videos or even something like this as a podcast requires some creative effort. And it's funny because if you have a spectrum of focus and creativity comes in some. There's a lot of different theories of creativity, but for me, creativity and creative work comes from having a scattered mind, an unfocused mind, where you can kind of view a lot of different bits of information at once and draw connections and kind of just keep going, especially if you're talking, which is the opposite of focus, right? So I find it really interesting that here I am doing creative work about focus, but in order to do that work, you kind of can't be completely focused. So at least that's my perspective on it. That's my take on it. So here we go. Consciousness hacking. Probably what I'll do is I'll release maybe like a 5-minute preview of this on youtube.com/Steve Cronin, where you all, I assume, know me from. I did kind of touch on this in the form of a paragraph on stevecronin.com, where I kind of blog irregularly from time to time. But this is where the meat is, right? This is where it's going to be. And today I want to touch on the perspective of consciousness hacking primarily from an integral theory perspective. Integral theory is a philosophy created by an individual, an author, a storyteller, a philosopher named Ken Wilber. If you watch some of my older YouTube videos, you'll see me reference him a lot, and he's really shaped and transformed my life in a lot of ways. I started reading his work around 2004, 2005. It was 2005, I think. And he kind of presents this model, this map of the mind that I am very sympathetic to. And, it's important to keep in mind that, that famous phrase, the map is not the territory, right? Popularized by people like Timothy Leary, like Robert Anton Wilson. And so this is just a map, and these are just models, and they're not indicative of reality in the sense of us actually knowing what's going on, because the mind in many ways is still a mystery to all of us, right? So And really, and in grad school, I studied transpersonal psychology, which really delves deep into different models of consciousness and how we identify with ourselves and with our minds. So really, this is consciousness hacking is right up my alley, and it's a topic that I want to explore in a podcast. So let's get started. I think I'm going to start by kind of just referencing some of Ken's work. I'm gonna take a sip of some vitamin water mixed with water. I drink the Whole Foods brand vitamin water, but it's really sweet. I drink the 0-calorie version, sweetened with stevia. Stevia is incredibly sweet, so I do half and half. Water, filtered water with this, and it works pretty well. I just know that some of y'all are gonna love this kind of like toned down, not like, hey guys, let's go on a toned down audio podcast. I'm standing at my standing desk recording this. Some of you are gonna love this kind of like jumping around stuff, but I imagine some of you will want more focused material. But for that, you can go to my YouTube channel. So, integral theory, how does it relate to, first of all, what is integral theory? Integral theory is a way of thinking, it's a philosophy that is akin to inclusivity, right? Integral theory will argue that not one tradition, not one practice, not one school of thought has all of the answers for everything. Integral theory will argue that every perspective, whether it comes from an individual or an organization or a field of study, has a very important piece of the puzzle that could be truth, and that we have to kind of like analyze and take in information from all perspectives in order to get a more complete picture of what's going on in the world. And you can really apply that to anything. I tend to apply it to my work with biohacking, transpersonal psychology, stuff like that. And but I suppose you can apply it to other fields of study. But we're not going to talk about other fields of study. So in regards to the mind, so that's Ken Wilber. That's his integral theory. He has written on transpersonal psychology, he's actually one of the reasons why I studied transpersonal psychology in grad school, and he's written a lot about the mind and consciousness. Okay, so what is consciousness, right? Well, that's a really interesting question. For the purposes of this podcast, I'm just going to say, to simplify it, I'm just going to say that consciousness, let's say it's akin to awareness, this sense of I, right? And we'll treat it like that for now. So consciousness you can look at consciousness in a lot of different ways, but we're going to look at it in two different ways. And we're going to look at what are called states of consciousness and stages of consciousness. And these will be kind of like foundation for some stuff we're going to talk about later when we get into consciousness hacking. So we'll start with a state. A state of consciousness, there's three main types: your waking state, your dreaming state, and your deep sleep, dreamless state. And with those three broad categories, there's who knows how many numbers, dozens, hundreds, maybe near infinite. I always like that term, even though it doesn't make any sense. Near infinite. Maybe there's near infinite substages of these states or subcategories of these states of consciousness. Within the waking state, you can have altered states. They can be induced by sound, induced by visual stimulation, induced by drugs, and these altered states is a whole nother category. In the dreaming state, you can have lucid dreaming, right? The sense of awareness that is held, the sense of I am that is held through the dream state. And arguably through the deep dreamless state as well. States of consciousness are transitory, right? They come and they go. Emotions relate to states of consciousness. If you're happy and you're in a good mood, that's not permanent. That has its peaks and its valleys, but the inverse of that is true. If you're not in a good mood, that doesn't last forever. And so the mind is always kind of changing in regards to states. And something akin to what someone might describe as a revelation or a spiritual experience or an intellectual realization. These are states of consciousness. Focus, okay, what my YouTube channel is about. Focus is a state of consciousness. And so a lot of consciousness hacking are tools and practices and methods to induce certain states of consciousness when you want them. But it's important to know that they're not permanent, and that's, I think, the primary thing that someone should know when learning about states of consciousness. Taking this up there. Stages of consciousness. This kind of relates to developmental psychology. So states of consciousness, we get a lot in the Eastern world with meditation and stages of enlightenment and Eastern religious traditions and spiritual traditions are all about states. And in Western psychology, we learn a lot about stages of consciousness through many different forms, but I like to kind of look at them through the form of developmental psychology. And so there are conscious structures that people go through, right? Piaget is a well-known developmental psychologist that described these stages that people go through from birth to death, right? A 5-year-old does not have the same outlook or perspective on the world as a 25-year-old. And that is because they have different structures of consciousness, which probably relate to physiology and also experience, right? And so this sense of development is really important because you can have a 5-year-old interpret the same state of consciousness that a 25-year-old has, and they'll interpret it differently. What's really interesting about stages of consciousness is that they're experienced by an individual, but they're also experienced by groups of people and all of mankind, all of humankind, right? Groups of people go through these stages of consciousness, and different developmental psychologists like Robert Kegan, philosopher Jean Gebser, describe stages of consciousness that we kind of see trending through our history as humans. And as we evolve, it seems like humans, when they're born, will kind of have access to higher stages of consciousness than their predecessors. So one of these stages of consciousness, to give you an example, since I gave you so many examples of states, the rational stage of consciousness was thought to really be expressed during the period of enlightenment, the Enlightenment period of our history. We really saw rational thinking really grip humanity. Prior to that, maybe we saw kind of this magical thinking, the idea of burning the witch at the stake kind of thing, maybe grip hold. And it's important to say right now, actually, because stages of consciousness does imply a hierarchy, right? Development. But it's not to say that one stage is better than another stage, because looking at this from an integral theory perspective, every perspective has something to teach us, right? So in regards to consciousness hacking, we it's kind of twofold for me, at least. We want to hack our way to certain states of consciousness, but we also want to consider what stage we're at and also consider how to accelerate growth in those stages, and then maybe later interpret the states differently. And that is a very general way to look at the mind in terms of hacking consciousness. That's kind of like the framework that I start with. I would, for states and stages of consciousness and looking at maps of this stuff, what I'll do is in the post that I'm posting, this MP3 file in the Patreon feed, I'll include some maps so you can kind of see how stages of consciousness are mapped out, and so you can get a sense of, read the descriptions, maybe get a sense of where you're at. There are assessments you can take to figure out where you're at. So I'll include that in this podcast. Okay, so let's get into some meat. So I want to kind of review some material that Ken's done with this audiobook he produced with Tammy Simon called Cosmic Consciousness. I don't want to get to that. The title is it sounds kind of woo new agey, right? But there's some interesting stuff in here that I think is going to facilitate our journey with consciousness hacking together. So we're going to start with that. So one important concept to understand is that states of consciousness, the more you experience some of these states of consciousness that you're not used to, these non-ordinary states, which doesn't have to be altered states, but anything that's non-ordinary for you, right? And that's kind of like a relative term. The more you experience these non-ordinary states of consciousness, they facilitate growth in the stages of consciousness. And it's a theory that seems to work. And so not only when you are practicing getting into states of focus, not only are you mastering certain states of focus or other states of consciousness, whatever it is you're trying to induce, but you're also helping yourself grow in stages. And of course, when you get to another stage of consciousness, then your understanding of some of these states that you've been working with grows as well. So states and stages really work together. One kind of like side effect of this is the idea of holding your awareness throughout all three major states of consciousness, because it does seem for a lot of people, including myself, that the awareness, that sense of I, kind of dissipates when we're not in the waking state. However, with these kinds of practices of inducing states of consciousness, the sense of awareness can still occur even through other major states of consciousness, like, for example, the dream state. And of course, holding an awareness in the dream state is essentially what lucid dreaming is, right? So that is kind of another kind of cool side effect, and it's something that we see in these long-term meditators, where they hold an awareness throughout the waking state, like we all do, but then as we fall asleep, they'll hold an awareness through the dream state, and some people even claim through this deep dreamless state, which is actually really, really incredible from my point of view, because that is essentially living and continuing to experience life in a way that is really dark for most people. Now, is this, this seems to be a side effect. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing to lucid dream every night? I don't know. I don't think anyone really does. But I think it's kind of cool. And I certainly have had some really cool lucid dreams. And I certainly had dreams where I didn't have an awareness, but when I woke up and I had memories of them, they were really amazing, insightful bits of information. And dreaming is an entirely different podcast, really. And maybe this can be something in the future. I'm going to jot this down really quick to talk about dreams and what they are, what they could be, what they could mean for us, not only in terms of consciousness hacking, but in personal development, which certainly affects focus and productivity and a greater understanding of ourselves, which then can give rise to the energy for us to be more productive, right? So it all really does tie together. And it also comes into some of this quantified self technology that has been popularized recently, even more so, as well as these different machines and gadgets that interface with our brain, which let's get into in this podcast. Why not, right? So states of consciousness. Here I am trying to introduce the difference between states and stages, and I can still mix up the words. podcast number one, bear with me here. I'm really just kind of flying off the cuff with this stuff. I have maybe five lines of notes in a notepad. It's probably a total of like 15 words to refer to, just to order information. So I'm really flying off the cuff just based on knowledge and stuff I've read pretty much for the past 12 years, which is pretty incredible. And it occurs to me now that I think show notes might be helpful for y'all. So I will kind of re-listen to this after it's recorded and then reference everything that I talk about, so it's more digestible for you guys and gals. Right. So states of consciousness, focus, etc. They correlate to physiological change in the brain. And that seems to make sense. When you have a subjective awareness of something and it changes, the subjective awareness it changes, it would make sense that the physiology of the brain would change as well. And one of the ways we can measure this is through brain waves, right? This is what an EEG device can do. And brain waves are just kind of changes in electrical patterns in your brain. And we have different, brain names for them: alpha wave, beta wave, delta, etc., right? And so, for example, a kind of like a standard waking state brainwave would be beta, right? A kind of relaxed, focused state would be alpha brainwaves. If you're asleep, you'll have delta brainwaves, right? And these can be measured by EEG devices, which I wanted an EEG device when I was 17 in 2005, and they weren't. There weren't consumer grade EEG devices back then to buy. Now you can buy something like the Muse headband or the NeuroSky, right? I don't necessarily recommend buying those. It depends on what you want to use them for. The NeuroSky is a little tricky to set up, and you can get third-party software to kind of like measure raw data, so you can kind of see what your brain is doing, and that's great. The Muse is a little more tricky, and I also have the Muse and haven't really reviewed it or the NeuroSky on my YouTube channel, even though I've had these devices I've had the Muse for about 6 months and the NeuroSky for well over a year. But the point being, there are now consumer grade EEG devices where you can see what's going on with your brain. And I think that's incredible. I think that's amazing. So there's the idea of, just becoming aware of physiological change in your brain while you're doing different practices, whether it be like, meditation or whatever. It kind of has this effect where the more you become aware of something, the more chance you have to kind of be able to manage it, or dare I say, even kind of control it or gain some mastery over it, right? And that's why biofeedback is really useful in a lot of different ways, whether it's, kind of like anxiety, stress management, or even to grow and develop and become, a better beholder of your brain and your mind, right? So how can you induce some of these states of consciousness, right? Well, contemplative practices, which have been thoroughly documented in religious and spiritual traditions throughout history, such as meditation, yoga, etc., do start to kind of open up awareness into these subtle states, and therefore, when you open up awareness to them and you practice them more, you can get a greater sense of them and perhaps a mastery of them, as I mentioned briefly before. So, but also there's really cool technology available to us right now. Yeah, like we have the binaural beats, which have actually been planning to make a YouTube video on that one for a while too. But binaural beats, sound and light, by the way, but binaural beats are a method of using sound to try to induce specific brain waves that are associated with different states of consciousness. So it's kind of like going in the reverse. It's kind of like what causes what, right? Like they're correlative data, right? But they seem to work, and there's EEG evidence for this. If you use a binaural beat, which is essentially a program of sound, and I won't go into too much detail here of how it works, but essentially by having two tones, one in each ear using headphones, and then having frequency of one being different than the other, you can kind of measure it out to have your brain produce a particular brainwave. And for whatever reason, your brain compensating for the difference between these two tones tends to produce a brainwave. And I'll link you to some information about binaural beats. Same thing can be done with light. I have this what's called the Procyon AVS audio-visual system, where it has glasses with flashing lights, and flashing lights can also induce certain states of consciousness, kind of induce those brain waves that are associated with various states of consciousness. For example, we see high amounts of theta brainwave activity in high performance states or creative states. So it's very primitive and crude, but it's a start, right? And it's kind of cool to have these tools available to us for consciousness hacking. There's also the transcranial stimulation stuff, which I've played around with and haven't actually had much success with. However, I'll link to some of those tools below. I do remember using specifically one called Alpha Stim, which is not transcranial, but it actually you clip on, you deliver electrical signals through your earlobes. Alpha Stim was a device that I use to try to promote alpha brainwaves. Did not have much success with it, however, and this stuff doesn't work for everyone. As I said, it is very crude, but for me, the binaural beats are amazing. I really like the company iAwake Technologies. There's one for your phone called iDoser, which is it kind of turns me off a little bit because it's kind of marketed to kind of like maybe younger people, such as teenagers or something. A lot of their, generally when you see a binaural beat program, it'll be for focus or for help falling asleep or creativity or something like that. iDoser, this app for your phone will, oh my God, I just coughed into the microphone, rookie podcaster here. iDoser will be like, oh, here's an ayahuasca experience. Here's what it's like to take drugs. And I kind of think that's kind of ridiculous. But it's easily accessible from your phone if you happen to have a smartphone. And their programs for falling asleep and stuff work really well. So just because I don't like the way they market their stuff doesn't mean that there hasn't been apps there that have really worked for me from that company. iAwake is also really great. iAwake is incredibly reputable company. They kind of have a marketing that I also don't like. They go in a different direction though. Instead of marketing get these digital drug doses, they have more of a spiritual kind of context to their marketing. But which for me is maybe sometimes a bit too much. But I also have really enjoyed their content and their software. It's still been high quality. So it's an age-old lesson, right? Like, marketing does not really equate to quality, aka do not judge a book by its cover. It's really interesting. If you go to YouTube.com and if you search in here, Ken Wilber stops his brainwaves, which I'm going to do right now, you'll come up with this really interesting YouTube video. Yep, it's called exactly that. Ken Wilber stops his brainwaves from the Integral Life channel, in which you can actually see Ken. I love how this video was posted 10 years ago. I think it was actually made in the 90s. But you can see Ken, and he has an EEG unit on, and it has a visual component, so you can see in real time what the electrical activity in his brain is doing. And then he goes into different meditative states, right? And Ken is a seasoned meditator, and you can actually see his brain waves in certain ways reduced to essentially zero, right? Where there's no activity. What's really interesting, and this kind of goes back to consciousness hacking in terms of having an awareness, holding an awareness throughout the major states of consciousness you go through in your life, waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. Something that could be indicative of that from a more objective point of view is if you're dreaming, if you're sleeping and you have this predominantly delta brainwave, but in addition to that, you also have like an alpha or a beta, then that's indicative of having an awareness when maybe you're not supposed to, or maybe when generally most people don't. Really cool YouTube video. It is quite long. It's about 10 minutes, but definitely worth checking out if that's a direction that you want to go in. But I guess the point being is that there's EEG evidence for this stuff for states of consciousness. There are tools available to us to help induce different states of consciousness, to help hack our consciousness and grow those stages of consciousness as well, accelerate that kind of vertical development through stages of consciousness. And that is really the information for a foundation on consciousness hacking. And I think I will do a part 2 to this at some point. Probably not next month. As for now, this will be a monthly ordeal here. But there's definitely a lot of stuff to get into. And yeah, this is a Patreon-only podcast. Thanks so much for listening. You can check me out. You're obviously getting this from patreon.com/Steve Cronin. I'm on youtube.com/Steve Cronin, stevecronin.com, Steve Cronin on Twitter. And I will eventually come up with a better format for this podcast, but really wanted to get this out there and get feedback from y'all and kind of develop it that way, because that's how I developed my YouTube channel, was through feedback from y'all, from all of you guys and gals out there. And that's how I was able to grow my YouTube channel, was by listening to you. So let me know in the comments on this Patreon post, or send me a direct message on Patreon, because I will talk to you. Right? There's so many comments on my YouTube channel, I can't respond to everybody, but really, going to make a focus to talk to all my patrons, because you guys are what lets me explore these topics further and in more detail, and produce more high quality content for everyone. That's it for now, folks. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.